Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 229, Primary Experience. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Libenson.
And I'm Lex Rofeberg.
And we are here to do a recap episode as we do after a bunch of interviews. I feel like we're trying to get Judaism Unbound sort of back on track in a way after the last 3 months in which we've done these somewhat similar, somewhat different things relating to the COVID situation. We've had a lot of previous guests talking about things that related directly to COVID. And now we're starting this process of moving back towards what we've been doing all along on Judaism Unbound, which is looking at all the things that we should be thinking about in terms of the Jewish future. And I think it's interesting to think about how that fits with COVID, because clearly this is now a new element in the Jewish future that we have to kind of keep in mind while it's going on, after it ends. I mean, there's a lot, everything has changed, and yet I also have this feeling that I want to go back to our conversations that don't always only have to do with COVID or things that are related to that. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's the right answer or not, but that's kind of where I'm sitting right now. Before we jump into it, I want to put out there the request that we usually do in these kinds of wrap-up episodes, which is that if you're someone who listens to Judaism Unbound regularly and or somebody who's been really appreciating what we've been putting out there through Jewish Live, the thing that we really need from folks is financial support. Just a little bit. It adds up. There's a lot of people out there that are using this stuff. Unfortunately, they're not all sending in their donations, but we imagine a time when people really will and want to. And I know at least a lot of people are sitting at home these days. Maybe they have a few extra seconds to head over to our website, which is www.judaismunbound.com/donate. and make a small donation. We really aren't asking for thousands of dollars. We're really saying that if everybody out there was listening, was giving $1 for every episode that you listen to, so if you listen to every episode, something like $50 a year, that would be a really great way to support a Jewish nonprofit. And these days, as things are all changing, and a lot of the big nonprofits are really struggling, because some of these other business models that are not about being supported by the people who are most actively using what you're doing are running into some challenges these days, and so maybe a different business model is really called for now, and we're trying to put that into the world. So Lex, let's jump into our conversation. I know that this is a little bit in contradiction to what I just said about not wanting to talk about COVID so much, but
we're good at contradictions. That's great.
But I think that it's something that's on my mind. We talked about it a little. You pushed back at me a little bit, but I want to put it out there because I think it actually connects to some of what we've been talking about. In particular, our amazing conversation with Casper ter Kuile about his much more amazing book, The Power of Ritual, which, by the way, I keep emphasizing, I mostly listen to audiobooks in my life. And one of the real frustrations for me in wanting to read all these Jewish books is that they often don't come out as audiobooks. I should note also, by the way, for fans out there, that The Orchard by Yochi Brandis, which I translated, is going to come out as an audiobook finally after
nice.
A couple of years, and that's going to be coming this spring. So that's super exciting to me because I love audiobooks. And Casper's
audio
book
comes from the Hebrew words ad and yah, which means until God. So it takes you towards holiness. That's why you love audiobooks so much.
That is the reason. And but Casper's book is read by him. And if you listen to the episode a few weeks ago that we did with him, you will know why that is a major selling point of the book. So anyway, Casper's book talks about this idea, among others, that we should be treating the things that we do every day as rituals or as potential rituals, that we can make meaning out of the things that we do every day. I've actually been thinking about a variant of that has to do with things that we may not do every day, but that we ought to do every day, and that maybe having them become ritualized is a way to make sure that we do them every day, and perhaps a way that we can influence others. And what I'm specifically talking about is wearing a mask. Because these days, as I walk around the streets in my neighborhood, I see people that are walking around without masks. And it's not people that are like on a solo walk through the park, and they're not near anybody. And so you could argue, that's illegitimate. You just put on a mask when you're near people and you're not able to socially distance. But I'm talking about on like a busy street, on a busy pedestrian street. And I walk around and I see a lot of people wearing masks, but I also see a lot of people not wearing masks. And I'm thinking that, you and I have talked about different ways to think about the should and ought in Judaism, but I kind of aspire to a world in which no Jew could not wear a mask, right? The idea that what it means to be a Jew is to wear a mask. And I think that the way I draw some of that thinking is, from pieces of Jewish wisdom that are very ancient, like the idea that one who saves a single life saves the entire world, or the idea of loving the stranger, and that the mask is less about protecting yourself and more about protecting others from you. So love the stranger feels apt to that. And I'm thinking about, like, would there be a way in which a mask could kind of be the new kippah, the symbol of being a Jew, and one that, kind of wouldn't have religious connotations the way that I perceive a kippah to be. I know you have a different take on it, but I'm thinking, like, could we somehow create a mask that, you would wear it as kind of an act of Judaism, and it would be like a lot of the ritual garb that Judaism tends to have. Like if we're talking about a kippah or a talis, or the talis that goes under your shirt, the tzitzit, the sort of a small version of a talis that many Orthodox Jews wear. And a lot of times it's meant to be kind of a reminder to you about these kind of obligations that you've taken on, and also a sign to others outside that, I am a Jew. And what it means to be a Jew, ideally, is that means I have these values and I care about others, etc. And I don't actually think necessarily that the ritual garb that we have in Judaism today actually accomplishes that. But I think that like a Jewy mask would. But I'm intrigued by the notion of saying, are there new Jewish rituals that we could create out of things that we ought to do every day, even though we may not actually do them every day? That's a little different from what Casper's talking about.
So you're right that I feel mixed about this, but I feel some things that are very positive about what you just said. So what I agree with is I think we have an issue with Jewish clothes or signifiers where those clothes or signifiers do not mean to people like ethical commitments. Like I don't think, I mean they might indirectly. I don't think that they're entirely independent. Like for me, wearing a kippah does serve certain kinds of ethical reminder, but like I think for most people, wearing a Star of David or a chai necklace or anything that is like a common Jewish article of clothing or jewelry or whatever, it doesn't like say anything about how you act or what you think, which I think I see that as less of a problem than you do, but I still acknowledge that it is a problem. I'm with you that I would like, and I actually wear some kinds of Jewish things that do signify ideological commitments. Some of my kippot, I have like an If Not Now yarmulke from the organization If Not Now that I've been actively involved in, and that does all sorts of work for justice and specifically focuses on anti-occupation work, which is exceedingly important right now as annexation approaches. But I think that we should be flexing that muscle. And I think that what's under the surface for why we don't have more of that is a kind of insecurity, or like this historical thing where like sure, the evangelical Christians, or like even not just evangelical, like Christians can have their big signs on the street with quotes from the Bible and whatever. But like we Jews we don't want to be too we don't want to be too loud and public, and we don't want, like, it draws attention, and like, what if that leads to people who don't like the quotes that we're saying or the ideological commitments we're saying, like doing terrible things to us. And like, from my perspective, I'm not denying any of that's real, but I think we need to really state that, like, there are things in this world that matter more than the fears we have about Jewish safety. There are actually those things. Now, my question is to go to your specifics with the mask. Like, by definition, even as you and I are aligned that COVID's going to be a long time and that we all should be wearing masks for a while, it's not a long term. I mean, you and I talk about schemes of hundreds and thousands of years. Like, it's not at all the case, I don't think, that wearing a mask will be the same kind of ethical commitment in even 5 years. I mean, maybe, like, that would be awful. I hope it's not. But like, that's part of my concern about the mask. But the other piece is practically, I'm not sure how much you could read on a mask, and how close people look at them. And then there is, for me, the question of whatever, some people talk about virtue signaling. For me, that's not really the right term, but like, just sort of the way in which it would just be sort of like, that it could be, if not done thoughtfully, just sort of a shorthand way to feel like you're doing action that stands in for broader action. And like, right now, in a moment where I especially think that there's a real obligation for all of us, especially those of us who are white, to be participating in racial justice struggles, if I were to have a mask, I would want it to send a message along those lines, and start to send the message that a Jewish act is to stand in solidarity with Black lives. I don't want to spend time with the Jews who are out there screaming all lives matter, or who are like actively not wearing masks and endangering people. Like, that's not my group of people. And I feel more in common with somebody who's not Jewish, but shares more of my values than those people, to go to like our Brene Brock test that we always talk about. But I still think that there's some like obstacles with the mask. And so I've been thinking about like tattoos, which I think, especially if you put them in some place that you could easily show to the world. And I also thought about, and this is, you know, an appropriative act, but from a powerful, like, hegemonic culture, I've thought about the Jesus bracelets. Well, what would Jesus do bracelets? Like, for a long time, I actually wore a bracelet every single day. It broke. Nothing changed, but like the bracelet broke and I didn't replace it with the same one. I wore one from a nonprofit that I hold very dear, and it was very important to me, and nobody else knew this. They probably didn't even know what it meant. It said CC Champions on it, which is now an organization called Connecting Champions. But it was this rainbow bracelet. And for me, it was a reminder of some of my commitments to better the world. And it also, because it was a rainbow, it had like a little part that was blue. And so given that the Torah talks about having like a blue thread in your seat, in your reminder shawl, not shawl, on your like having a reminder on the threads of your outfit, basically, that was like kind of my blue thread. And it did on occasion actually remind, like I had the experience of looking at it and be like, oh yeah, I like need to act a certain way. It like works, that ritual. So I agree with you that it's a real issue that we need to like have ideological commitments in our fabric, in our garments, in ourselves. I'm not as convinced about how to go about it.
In some ways, I think that you and I often are saying the same thing, but meaning like neither of us wants to hang around with the Jews who are saying all lives matter or any of that stuff, or who are not wearing masks or who are not doing any of the things that like we think on an ethical level like people should do. And I think one difference is that I want to define Judaism as those people, whereas you are taking a much more, I would say historically accurate.
Well, I just don't want you or anybody else to have that power, basically. Like,
I don't want to have the power to do it. I just want it. I want it to happen, naturally and definitionally. Meaning, what I want to do is create and the way that I think that this kind of thing happens. Right, I'm not looking for some rabbinic authority to mandate that all Jews should wear masks, for example. I mean, if I'm trying to suggest that somehow we make it a norm by just doing it. but doing it in a very consciously Jewish manner. And then people who are into that will follow, and it'll grow and grow as a practice. So now I don't know if that's a mask. I'm intrigued by the idea of a mask only because like I want to be able to. I'm troubled by the idea that a Jew who takes Judaism seriously would go out without a mask. Like that feels very troubling to me. And I don't know exactly how, societal norms or societal rituals like Casper's talking about, how they come about. I think they come about by people that you admire doing them. And, one person does it, and another person say, hey, that's cool. Where'd you get that mask? And it's, I got it here. Right. And eventually it sort of catches on. And now that could be a mask. It could be T-shirts. Like, I'm actually intrigued by the idea that if you could wear a T-shirt every day for a year, who's going to want to go out, into the world again with a tie? And so I think there's an opportunity to like design lines of T-shirts that are maybe a little bit more presentable or something like that, but that have like slogans on them, or like little, but in a certain way that maybe like fits in the Zoom screen or whatever, And again, I could imagine that like there's a Jewish line of T-shirts, that like the expectation is that everybody buys 7 of them. They're sold in packages of 7.
Now you're trying to sell me on it. I love my 7s. Yeah. I see what you're doing.
Yeah. So like we're trying to, like the expectation is that we want people to wear these T-shirts every single day. And they each have, some kind of like phrase from the Jewish tradition that either can be about like caring for the health of strangers, or like you say, Black Lives Matter, maybe they can have like double slogans, right? Because they can say something like, or, I think I've seen a sign that says something like Black Lives Matter is Tikkun Olam or something like that, and so, whatever they might be. But the idea is that we could remind ourselves, and we could also, and I don't mean virtue signaling in the way that says to others like, hey, I believe in this stuff, but actually I don't do anything about it. Like, but that signals to others like, I do things about this, and I think it's an ethical imperative, and I want you to also. But if you just see me walking on the street when there's not a protest going on, you don't know that I'm, a big supporter of Black Lives Matter. If I wear a T-shirt all the time that says Black Lives Matter, then you do. And so what I'm looking for is a way to both explicitly tie that to Judaism, and by that I mean the Judaism that I'm hoping that will come about, not necessarily the Judaism that has been in the past, and that and where you kind of are creating, doing something that I think actually is a Jewish tradition, has been a Jewish tradition, right? Which is using our clothing in a conscious way to signal to ourselves and others, or to remind ourselves and signal to others who we are aspiring to be in the world. And I'm intrigued by that. I've never been attracted to it because I personally have felt that wearing a kippah or yarmulke feels to me like it's overly religious. Like it feels to me like it's about God, and I don't want to signal something about God. And I know that that's not why you wear a kippah, and I think that other people could wear a kippah for different reasons. But for me, it's always felt like not the symbol that I'm looking for, and like wearing a tallis or a tallis under my shirt. Those just don't feel like they're too much about God, and that's not what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at is the other ethical practices of Judaism. And so I'm looking for different clothing that I actually would be willing to wear, in order to try to ritualize those beliefs.
Positive peer pressure. What you're talking about is creating norms. I firmly agree with you that there are certain things that it repulses me not all Jews do. Or at the very least, it repulses me that not all Jews that can do. So for me, I always bring up, and I have in the past, precisely because of the point I'm making, that I care about this so much. Blood donation. Like, it makes me angry. It makes me actually angry that most people who are eligible to give blood do not regularly. It doesn't make me more angry about the Jews than everybody else. But like, because I'm part of the Jews and spend a lot of my efforts on making it the best Jewish community I can, it bothers me that there isn't a positive peer pressure in place. Like, it should be embarrassing. I'm sorry to say this to listeners who don't give blood. Like, I feel this very strongly, but like, it should be frowned upon. It should receive the kinds of negative consequence that something stupid and trivial like bacon in a synagogue would get in most synagogues. Like, we do have peer pressures in Jewish life. We have tons of them, but we are allocating them in silly ways sometimes. And we should be directing them in life-saving ways. So masks, life-saving. Done deal for me. I absolutely want there to be that positive peer pressure. I want people, and I'm not saying this to be an asshole, but like the way society works is some people are motivated positively by, I really want to do X, Y, or Z right thing. Then there's people who like, they don't really want to do that thing, but they're motivated to not cross social lines. They don't want everybody to think that they suck. So they're not gonna be blatantly publicly racist. Usually, I mean, we still have people who are blatantly publicly racist, but like, there's plenty of people who, if the people they care about will frown on them for that thing, even if they would do it otherwise, they won't. So I want to create those norms with you. I want absolutely to do everything in our power so that it is not comfortable in a Jewish space for somebody to walk in without a mask. I do not want to treat it as like a libertarian individualist. Everybody's going to do what's right for them. Like I believe in collectives, and I believe that there are things that actually people should feel are right or wrong and not just customized to every person. I also think there are some things that are customized to every person, but like that's an overriding need for our Jewish world and for society, because when we don't create those norms, that's when shit hits the fan. Like, we're still wrestling and still seeing upticks in the number of cases of COVID because, sure, we created a norm to some extent, but we never fully like succeeded as a society, as a collective, right, creating the level of norm we needed to. So there's life or death involved in all of this, and I'm with you on that. What we disagree on is sort of what to call it and like what it would mean for somebody who doesn't toe these norms. Like, I'm not that interested in like the linguistic exercise of classifying people as, okay, so if you're doing the thing, you're Jewish. If you're not doing the, like, I'm more interested in like, yeah, let's hammer home that norm and make it so that what people are worried about isn't, oh, I don't know how to read the right words on the page in the Siddur, or I don't know like the right acronyms to drop in conversation to show I'm part of Jewish life. Like, let's have that stuff no longer matter to people. And what matters be like, oh, I don't want it to look like I'm not wearing a mask. I don't want it to look like I'm somebody who doesn't give a crap about saving lives through blood donation. That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. One sort of connected point that we don't have to talk about at length if you don't want to, and then we can move on to other things, but it's been on my mind relating to COVID. And I have to say, to start this by saying, like, look, the vast majority of Jewish institutions, I think, have actually done a reasonably good job of being responsible in terms of COVID. But what's interesting is that how some of them have to do that, fighting against some of their members, who are looking to reopen in bigger ways. And I was sort of thinking, like, what if we thought about COVID as an anti-Semite? Meaning that COVID has killed more Jews.
That's brilliant.
Over the last, few months than any anti-Semite, I think, in, the memory of,
this is intersectionality.
Our lifetimes.
You're like doing the intersectionality on like in real time.
Well, right, and maybe by and I don't even mean this in like a stupid way, but maybe thinking about COVID as an anti-Semite would also help people understand a little more deeply what we've been trying to say and others are trying to say about the real fight being against white supremacy. Not this fight against, one another, within minority groups to say who's more oppressed, or whatever. The point is that we all have a common enemy, which is white supremacy, and with COVID, it's like, so yeah, it's also killing non-Jews, but it's going out there and, killing a lot of Jews. And if, let's say there was an actual anti-Semite around or an anti-Semitic group, and there were, and also that there are people that are like, just fears of it, right, makes all these synagogues, put in all these security measures, by the way, many of which end up being implemented in a racist way. But it's like, oh, well, of course we have to do that because there's anti-Semites out there, but here there's the biggest anti-Semite of all. And we ourselves are actually capable of making that anti-Semite not able to do its anti-Semitic actions, i.e. killing Jews, by like putting on a mask or by not having services, even socially distanced, whatever. It's like, let's just not have services for 6 months, and nobody should even be trying to have services. Why? Because there's an anti-Semite on the loose.
I would go out on a limb and say I know you're right. Like if there was somebody, we don't know how many Jews precisely have died from COVID. I don't know, and it's probably not as simple as just looking at the total number of cases and divided by 50, since Jews are the 2% of the population. It's probably more complicated than that. But like, yeah, let's say even a few dozen. It's way more than a few dozen Jews have died from COVID. But like, if there was any person or movement or group that directly on its own killed a few dozen Jews, that would be bigger than Pittsburgh, which was around 1 dozen Jews, and that would automatically be the biggest concern on everybody's communal agenda. You're right. Like that feels, I can't state it as fact, but it feels to me like it's not even an argument. Like that would so clearly unite everybody. And everybody's Facebook profile frame would be, standing against that. Everybody's sermons would be about that, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, the reason why I said like you're doing intersectionality is like I think what you said is a broader principle. It's not just about COVID. Like we as Jews constantly think of our Jewish interests as like a unique, separable thing from the rest of the world and from the world's interests. And you could argue the biggest potential anti-Semite right now is climate change. Like it was a huge confusion moment to society when in 2016, it's now more normal to say this, but in 2016, in the lead up to the election, there was a question in one of the debates about what's the greatest national security threat to the United States. And people on the stage said all sorts of things, and Bernie Sanders was the only one who said climate change. What? And it confused people because like how climate change, that's not like a threat against the United States specifically. That's a threat against the world. But like, guess what? If the world ends, the United States ends. So like we have to be able to think about, and I hope the map I'm making is clear, by the way. Like what I'm getting at with that is, defining nationalist interests as separable from global interests actually doesn't make any sense. Like there are ways in which both a nation and the world can be threatened simultaneously, just as there are ways in which Jews and everybody else can be threatened simultaneously by a disease. We need to be understanding the universal not as like this threat to the particular. As for so long, any idea of Jews doing universal things was called assimilation and seen as, oh my gosh, if people only focus on universal, like they're going to leave Judaism and Judaism's going to end. So like we're going to focus on the particular and Jewish education, teach it. And that way they won't be apathetic and they'll connect to their people. And but like, what if the thing that will connect us to Judaism in this moment is the ways in which Jewish participation in the movement for Black lives like grows or doesn't. If it doesn't, by the way, like there's plenty of people for whom they're not going to do the Jewish part. Like that is more of a threat than if Rosh Hashanah or Passover or Hanukkah are particularly interesting or compelling things.
This idea of Jewish exceptionalism is one of the greatest threats to Judaism, both on the positive and negative side, right? Because the idea that we should only care about Jewish issues in a positive way, and obviously nobody says that, but like the implication is that, when we talk about Judaism, we're talking about these like exclusion, these areas that are like secluded off that have to do with ritual behavior and whatever, that that's the biggest turnoff to Judaism for many Jews, and the idea that we should only have fears that are exclusively Jewish fears, meaning we should only be afraid of somebody who is only only hates Jews, these are the most scary people, the people that are specifically looking for synagogues to damage or to shoot or to whatever. And of course we should be afraid of those people, but whether it's climate change or COVID or white supremacy or a wide variety of forces are out there that are likely to kill many more Jews than any particular, exclusive anti-Semite might, then it's absurd that you would spend all of your energy protecting against the kind of exclusive anti-Semites. And yet, fundamentally, that's what we do. And, and I think it's a new way actually to think about like this question of, whether rabbis should talk, politics from the bima. Yeah, I'm not saying partisan politics, but, political issues from the bima, like climate change and whatever, racism. If you framed it a different way and said, these are the greatest threats to Jews, then of course the answer has to be yes. I mean, otherwise, what would possibly be, right? And nobody says that a rabbi shouldn't talk about anti-Semitism from the bima.
Yeah, well, yeah. So, by the way, going back to what you said before about the peer pressure. I mean, I said peer pressure, but what you were talking about in terms of everybody wearing masks and like making a world where a Jew like who wouldn't wear a mask would be like really taking a social risk, like that would be like a huge statement, and they would be going against the entire rest of the like Jewish population. Like, I'm actually thinking about what you just said about like what a rabbi would say from the bima, and like I feel like, and I don't think you'll disagree with me. I care much more about what people say in the pews, or if there's no pews, in the kiddish, in the schmoozing afterwards. Like, I think that what's interesting is we so often see what the rabbi says from the front of the room as like the measure of where the Jews are at. But talk to a rabbi, and by the way, I'm not saying this as a good thing. I'm saying it kind of cynically. Whatever the rabbi says at the front of most synagogues, not all, there are courageous rabbis, but is often the end result of what that rabbi feels they can comfortably say. So, and whatever they think about whatever issue, they have to discern whether that's an issue at all that they can talk about from the bima without consequences of some kind. Now, I don't think most of the time they're going to get fired for it. I think that's sometimes how it's framed, but like there will be hard conversations and complicated whatever. And that's all peer pressure in the sense that I was talking about before. Like that all does political work and reifies a certain set of things as like talkable in religious context or in Jewish context, and a certain set of things as treif, for lack of a better term, as not allowed. But we should be focused on how, like, if we're just a random person in a synagogue or in a JCC or in a Jewish group that's not an institution, like, what norms are we creating just in our schmoozing? Like, what is taken for granted and what isn't? Like, this is why things like pronoun use are so important. Like, okay, so somebody at the front of a room can give a sermon about LGBTQ inclusion, and maybe even that person at the front of the room is wonderful and like understands how to really be a welcoming and empowering presence to Jews who are queer or to people who are queer. If there isn't a sense that like, oh my gosh, if I say she instead of they on purpose or if I forget frequently for somebody who is non-binary and who uses they pronouns, like my community member, like everybody in the room is gonna be upset with me. Like we it's not that I want people to be angry all the time and upset, but we have those norms on some things. Like it is understood, and trust me, if you're not a Zionist, you feel this in synagogue. Like it is understood that like it's not a safe thing to communicate that you oppose Zionism in most synagogues. That is not a safe thing to say. Now that could be good, that could be bad, like whatever it is, that's a norm that has been created in a variety of ways over time in most synagogues. And it's shifting right now, and it might not be a norm in a few decades, who knows, but like that's a norm. And if we're going to have those norms, and every social community has them, it's not that Jews have them more. Like we often talk about them more and make more policies about them, but like not always. So we just need to think about how, like, it's actually not just about what, and once again, this is not me disagreeing with you, Dan, but like, it's not just about what the rabbi says. It's what we as a community sort of say and do to pave a pathway for the authority figure to then say X, Y, or Z. Like my whole theory of community organizing, influenced by momentum and other kinds of ideas, is like what politicians do is an end result. Like that vote that comes to the House floor on whatever, let's say the Civil Rights Act of 64. It's not like, wow, what an amazing bunch of Congress people who like brought that to a vote and then voted the way that the Civil Rights Act of 64 would pass. Like, no, that is an end result of years and years and years of norm changing, like changing the weather so that like I mean, the reason you talk about it in changing the weather, it's like sometimes of year you wear a jacket because the weather is such that if you don't wear a jacket, it will be deeply uncomfortable. If you want to create, like, if you want a world where people don't wear jackets, you could try to take everybody's jackets individually, or you could turn up the heat on the world, and then people will take off their jackets. And so what you do as an organizer is you try to create those kinds of changes where it's not that on an individual by individual basis you like change everybody's opinion. It's that you shift the entire weather of the world that affects everybody and moves everybody a little bit on the spectrum of their opinion. So we got to do that Jewishly.
I really appreciate the distinction that you're making about the rabbi from the Bima and the people in the pews. And I think that that's a good way into a conversation a little bit that connects in certain interesting ways the conversations that we had over the last few weeks with Zach Kamenetz on the one hand, who is the rabbi who's trying to establish Jewish approaches to using psychedelics, and James Caan, who is the rabbi that is working in a cannabis company. And it's interesting because it's not necessarily only related to the fact that it happens to be that we were talking about psychedelics and cannabis, so we're actually talking about use of certain substances. It's part of that is what I want to talk about. But the other part that I find intriguing, right, is that James is working as he's a rabbi, and he's actually very conscious about calling himself a rabbi, but he works in a company, and he believes that he's bringing his perspective as a rabbi, his ethics, his values as a rabbi to a company, and in particular to a company where, society has questions about its ethics, and maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, but I mean, I'm not sure. I personally, of course, as I've been saying all along, I don't believe that a person has to be trained as a rabbi and call themselves a rabbi and go to rabbinical school and get ordained to do what James is doing. But I'm intrigued by the idea that at least some way in which you really immerse yourself deeply in Judaism, and then you go off and you do something not definitionally Jewish as a profession. I think that that's really interesting. And with Zach, we may be in a society in which, for a variety of reasons, and I know not everybody will even come close to agreeing with this, but perhaps in a safe way, we actually are able to, or will be able to, get something closer to a prophetic experience, a primary religious experience that the prophets probably had, whether because they were using substances or because they were able to get to those places through meditation or other means. And by the way, I would throw meditation in here as well. And there are other means that don't involve substance use that allow people to get to these really elevated states of consciousness. And I think we're seeing a lot of that. And I think that the idea of what religion is, or, again, I don't know if we want to call it religion, but whatever, we know what we're talking about, that is very different when you're talking about a small number of people in charge who may or may not have had some kind of primary experience with God, with the divine, with substances, with something, and they experience something really, really powerful, and they then try to translate that in some way so that regular people can have some version of that experience. It's actually a very different situation when the people can have the primary experience themselves. And again, we're talking now, because we just had these conversations about the primary experience being that sort of psychedelic, radically spiritual experience. But I think it also connects to the idea that we've talked about all along throughout this podcast, that most people are able to now have the primary intellectual experience that in the past only the leadership class has been able to have with Jewish ideas. And so I'm imagining a world, we talked about this a little bit offline the other day, where I'll put it out there in a certain kind of way, which I'm aspiring to a world in which either nobody is a rabbi or everybody is a rabbi. For me, basically, it would amount to the same thing, because I think that the question isn't what the title is. The question is I want a world in which, not necessarily, it doesn't have to be everybody, okay? I don't want to be caught in a word, but huge numbers of people are capable of and sort of expected to deeply immerse in the primary substances of Judaism. And I don't mean drugs there. I mean the material of it. And there's some expectation that like that's part of what it is to become a Jewish adult, let's say. And the expectation is not then that you then go and you become a professional Jew. The expectation is that somehow you absorb these experiences, these values, these virtues, these positions, these moral ways of thinking, and then you go off into the world and bring that Jewish, experience into the world so that you make the world a better place. And if we only have like 1% of the population or less being rabbis, then, basically they all have to be Jewish professionals because like we need those jobs. If, 25% of Jews are quote rabbis, then we can imagine a world in which, everybody kind of goes out and just brings Judaism into the world, which is like just a profoundly different way to think about Judaism, I think. And it goes to what you were talking about earlier in the sense that it's just saying it's like, Judaism is not a narrow thing. Judaism is not just about Judaism.
You caught where I was going to go, which is like, absolutely, this is an extension of what we said before. So like, we can take James at a marijuana company, right? Like, it's a big company. Like, they're a big company. And I don't know how many Jews versus others buy Holistic Industries products. I have no idea. My honest question to people would be like, okay, you have two hypothetical rabbis. One of them serves a congregation of 150 people who are all Jews, probably. I mean, there are some cool congregations that allow kinds of membership for those who aren't Jewish, but like most of them, they're probably all Jews or in the process of converting to Judaism. That's one kind of person who is a rabbi. Nobody questions that person is doing rabbinic work. That's obviously seen by everyone as rabbinic work. Now, take that identical person or somebody comparable and say they're working for Holistic Industries, and Holistic Industries is having an impact on, let's say for purposes of argument, it's also 150 Jews. I think it may be much more. Like, let's say it's the same number, and it doesn't need to be Holistic Industries, but like, let's say there's somebody working for a quote unquote secular company or for even just a secular nonprofit or an interfaith nonprofit. I know people who are rabbis who serve like interfaith communities or are interfaith chaplains, or there's somebody who works for like a UU church, a Unitarian Universalist church. Like, I think if you said to somebody, this person serves 150 Jews and 400 others who aren't Jewish, like all of a sudden it's like, well, is that person a rabbi? Like, they're not really serving just Jews. So like, are they really doing rabbi work? Is it a different thing? Like, when I tell people that I don't want to work in a synagogue necessarily, they're like, oh, so you won't really sort of be practicing as a rabbi. I'm like, no, I'll be practicing, whatever practicing means. It's an imperative to me that we achieve what you're talking about, where we recognize that, because at the end of the day, when you break it down, it's like an offensive thing. It's like you could be doing all of the work that the 150, let's say, once again, for purposes of argument, there is a rabbi who serves the same number of Jews as deeply. I'm not claiming that Holistic Industries has the same kind of deep relationship with its customers that a synagogue does with a small minority of its members. But like, let's say that there was somebody who worked for an interfaith nonprofit that is 10% Jews and mostly others, and it's really big, and it's a rabbi who is in charge. Like, it's offensive to me to think that is somehow like rabbi with an asterisk, or like, because that implies that the role of a rabbi or the role of a rabbi as representative of Judaism is to like serve Jews. I don't think that's the project. Like, and we could break this down to Seders. If you have 15 people at your Seder, at your Passover Seder, and they're all Jews, versus if you have 50 people at your Seder and 15 of them are Jews and 35 aren't, like, does the fact that you've shifted the percentage mean that your event is somehow like not really Jewish, it's interfaith? Like, no, it can still be Jewish while being other things. So if we were to create a world where like, wow, you walk into a Jewish space and everybody's talking about like, oh, I'm thinking of David Mark as a past guest on our show. He's a judge and also a rabbi. Like, where we'd have dozens upon dozens of those kinds of people, where it's not at the rabbinic conferences, oh, you work for a Hillel, you work for a different Jewish nonprofit, you work for a synagogue, it's like, oh, you work for a random, I don't mean random, like I want people to choose carefully, and I wouldn't want, like, personally, I would not want there to be a rabbi at like Amazon, which I don't think is like a salvageable, like I think it does problematic things for the world, but like in general, for there to be a norm where that's where the process is, I go to rabbinical school, or maybe it's a different kind of school in the future, but like I get some process of ordination. And then the fun exercise, the meaning exercise, is finding, where does that plug in specifically where there isn't a rabbi? Like, not which role of the 400 roles that have rabbi role, like which one's opening up and I'm going to then apply to those roles and fill it. Like, you'd actually all of a sudden be looking specifically for places that are not looking for rabbis, but you'd be enlivening those places with Jewish stuff. I'm hesitant to say Jewish values because I think Jewish is more than just values and beliefs, but like with Jewish teachings and texts and civilizational projects, whatever.
So the one thing that I want to add to what you're saying, or clarify in terms of what I was saying, is like, imagine that imagine that our gig here didn't continue, and I went off to, and I got a job at Holistic Industries. I'm not a rabbi. I don't want to be a rabbi. But I think that I've absorbed enough about Judaism and enough about like all the kind of orientations that James absorbed in rabbinical school that I think that I could have a very analogous role at Holistic Industries that James does. And so I'm imagining a world in which there's this whole world of non-rabbis, like meaning like I don't want to. I totally agree with you that I would love to see a future in which like the rabbinical convention includes people who say, "Oh, wait, which marijuana distributor do you work for?" Like that kind of thing. But I also would like to see a convention of people who work in any given industry. And, they get together, let's say, at 11 o'clock at the bar, we're going to have a gathering for all the people who have gone through the Shmabbai school, like meaning like there's something else that is not necessarily a rabbi, but it's a deeply immersive experience of Jewish, I don't know, Christians, I think, tend to call it formation, but that there's some kind of process that you go through where you're just you're a lay person on the other end of it, but you've kind of gotten a lot of like really deep spiritual, ethical, whatever, and also knowledge. And so like, I guess, there have been some times when we've put out a call for various ideas, see if our listeners are interested. Like, what if we opened a Shmabinical school? What if it was like a 2-year program, digital, and you could like sort of like deeply immerse in Jewish study and in like, I don't know what it looks like exactly, but the various parts that are in a rabbinical school that are not necessarily the parts about, the rabbinic role of the bima, but like pastoral, care, and I don't know what the curriculum would be, but it would be this like deeply immersive, like serious thing. Like I'm not talking about taking like, a course once every 3 years. I'm talking about like a deeply serious program.
Yeah, to me, it's not a rabbinical, it's not a shmabinical school. Like, let's make the Jewish heretical school. To me, it's like, in order for this to work, we have to stake out, we are in a sense really not only not the same, but like sort of contra certain and it's not that we have something against rabbis. Once again, I'm in rabbinical school and going to be ordained soon, but like there are real deficiencies and gaps resulting from a Jewish world where that is the major pathway to most of the like people who are seen as the highest level of leaders. We need the people whose project is not preservation of this Jewish system or Jewish inheritance, whatever we call it. We need people who train specifically to upend the thing in certain ways. Like, we actually aren't okay in a lot of ways, and we need desperately to change. We really need people who are trained and then go out into not specifically Jewish spaces, into spaces that are still Jewish. I'm saying specifically, uniquely Jewish, distinctly Jewish, only Jewish. We need people that are in those, because that is when the possibilities open expansively. That James talked about at the end of his episode. Like, he doesn't have any lines to toe. He closed with what I thought was a beautiful sentiment that I've heard rabbis express privately, but not publicly, precisely for the reason he identified, which is he is free to say what he wants publicly because he doesn't have like a Jewish constituency specifically that's going to push back. And he said, religion's made up, God's made up, Torah's made up, but that doesn't make it unholy or not sacred. It means that we get to make it up better. Yeah, I think you have to think that the thing is made up in order to have the permission to make it better. Like I, as somebody who holds Torah as a deeply important part of my life, somebody who holds Judaism writ large, to the extent there is a Judaism, like Jewish stuff as like important in my life, like, yeah, I think it's all made up. And that's not me dismissing it. That's me like allowing it to have power. Because if it wasn't made up, then it's like, and it's almost like an element on the periodic table with like a defined number of protons and neutrons and electrons and atomic mass. And like, okay, so that's what it is. And it has these properties. And then when you use it in the world, it does this. And I think that we actually are moving in the right direction. I can actually end this episode in an optimistic note. I think the rate at which we are making it up better needs to accelerate. But that's, for next time.
That's a good place to wrap it up. So let's keep accelerating.
Yeah, cool. We are going to close out this episode, and thank you for listening. Thank you for listening if it was just this episode to this one. Thank you for listening to others in this unit if you've listened to those. Thanks for whatever, time, effort you've put in. So we're going to close this episode out in the same way we always do, by encouraging you to be in touch with us. And there are a wide variety of ways for you to do that. First, there is our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound, and also Jewish Live, our other Facebook page. There are our websites, jewishlive.org and judaismunbound.com. There's our Twitter feed, which is @Judaism Unbound. And there are our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make, and which Dan mentioned at the top, is that we really do deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you can send our way. You can do that on a monthly recurring basis, which we really deeply appreciate, or as a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate or jewishlive.org/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.